front door approaches, and do you consider that to be successful?
Well, I have heard, I've never seen the Jesus film yet. I have heard from people I respect that the Jesus film has positively turned more heads than about anything else that's ever been launched in the rest of the world. Can it be used for good? Obviously, yes. Can it be used for ill? Obviously, yes. You know, the two young women who were captured at the start of the Afghani war, Heather Mercer and Dana somebody, Curry, they took it into Afghanistan. Now, they took it into a culture that thought any kind of video was sin. By the way, they took it into a culture as women in a patriarchal culture. From a missiological point of view, they did everything wrong. Of course, we hail them as heroes because they did it and they got free. And as a father, I'm absolutely delighted they got free. I didn't think they would, but they got free. Every ministry in Afghanistan, some of which had been there for 25 years, was thrown out because of it. So I would say that was not very shrewd. That was very problematic. That's not to say that the film has not had an enormous impact. And I always had a great deal of affection and appreciation for Bill Bright, who has since passed away, but a man with his vision just to do big things like that. It wasn't a gospel blimp. And there are lots of folks from many parts of the world, and I would suggest when they begin to talk to you tomorrow that maybe they can add to this. Overall, I think it did very well and does very well, but like anything else, if it's not used properly and shrewdly, it can have a negative backlash. In Afghanistan, it certainly did. Now, I'll come back to your other questions when someone says something that reminds me what it was. But does someone else have a question? Yeah. And sir, feel free to.
One of the suggestions you made is that we embrace authentic respect for the cultures that we consider going to share the gospel. It occurs to me that one of the reasons people have the idea in the first place to go out and share the gospel is this sense that we've got the truth and we're right. And by simple extension, though not necessarily logical, others are wrong. And this right-wrong dichotomy leads to disrespect. Perhaps because many of us haven't been taught differently. So I wonder what your thoughts are about the language that we use here in Evangelical America in talking about having the truth.
Well, it's a good question. And there'd be answers on all sides that would be valid and right. But there's no question that we have taken the gospel with a great deal of triumphalism into a world where we didn't assume we had to listen. We did the talking, and someone else had to do the listening. Now, that's a very general statement, and you can prove it wrong gratefully in a lot of places. I would say this, though. By and large, for every good missionary story, there tends to be a bad one. And we need to work to make sure that the bad ones go away. This issue of respect, put it in a slightly different context. There was a Pew poll recently that said, we don't know any more about Islam today than we did before 9/11. That's a profound lack of respect. We don't know. Knowledge and respect are linked. Our faith would be much more attractive, to get back to the original comment, if we dispensed it with humility, if we incarnated the principles, the themes, and the characteristics of Jesus Christ. That's not easy to do, but that's what it takes. I mean, that's what following Jesus is all about. Sometimes it's the way of the cross, which is what following Jesus is all about. But I think we have to do something in this world a little bit differently, and maybe we should be grateful that America is no longer a sending nation and that more missionaries come into America than go out of America. Maybe that's a good thing. There are other things we could probably do in the world, but don't go unless you got the message right, and don't go unless you got the tone right, because the tone of arrogance and triumphalism just puts people off. And it makes it that much harder for someone who knows what they're doing to come in and present an attractive faith. Here, let me just say one other thing, just to provoke you all. But I saw a bumper sticker in Richmond, Virginia 2 days ago. It said, I'm against church and hate. That was the bumper sticker. Church and hate. I know something about the website that started this. It's a non-Christian website. It's an anti-Christian website. But it's a website that looks at Christians, and what do they see? They see hate. They see hate. Because we divided the world and we decided to take this point of view, and everything else is wrong. I talk about absolutes. The problem with absolutes, we don't know them absolutely. Shouldn't that give us a little bit of humility? We see through a glass darkly. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are his ways and thoughts higher than ours. Why do we think we have to have all the answers when we're told that we don't have all the answers? Now, there's an awful lot of things that an Orthodox Christian holding on to the eternal verities of the faith will want to keep and will not compromise. That doesn't mean you can't listen. That doesn't mean you can't talk with respect and listen with respect. We got a lot of work to do that. It's not in our nature, by and large, as Americans. Who was the Hughes, Karen Hughes? You were telling me about Karen Hughes, who's in charge of winning the hearts and minds of people. So she goes to this conference with 800 people in Doha, and she simply talks to people until she's done talking. And she goes home. Now, she's pretty good. She gets it right more than she gets it wrong. But this is an example of what comes out of America and what people are pushing back against. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Susan, and I have a question about, can you share with us what the Lord has taught you regarding intervention on behalf of the persecuted versus walking alongside and ministering to the persecuted? Because the Lord often intends for good to come out of suffering. You know.
You really have to read my book.
I have read your book. Yeah.
Oh, and you're still asking the question. Well, then I'm sorry I brought it up. Okay, walking with and intervening.
Well, for example, in your position as ambassador, you know, there's probably a lot of temptation to intervene on behalf of the persecuted, where from a missiological standpoint, that God has, there's intention, God has purpose in the suffering, and walking alongside and ministering to the suffering.
I'm going to take exception to the phrase that people are better off if they're persecuted, or the suggestion that they're better off if they suffer. I mean, I think that's the role that Jesus tried to alleviate suffering. He bore suffering so he could alleviate suffering. And sure, there's an awful lot of good things. We had a conference, 2 conferences a year ago, one here, I think, where we talked about suffering and all the positive things that came out of it. But in terms of what motivates us, I don't think we can ever use the rationale that, hey, something good is going to happen because that person is really in bad shape. I can't wait to see what happens, that God's going to... No, we got to intervene. Now, some people intervene by walking alongside, being there. Some people intervene by yelling at governments. I'm happy to say that I've yelled at both governments and yelled at people on the ground in countries. And by the way, back to this gentleman's question, it's a whole lot easier to yell in Washington and get something done. When you yell sometimes in another country, you just get this kind of a situation that doesn't help anybody. Yeah, both are important. It's not enough simply, for example, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, to reach down and pick up the person who's been beaten by robbers. There comes a day when you got to go up in the mountains and roust out the robbers. You got to change the structure. And in terms of people who are being religiously persecuted, the way most often you change the structure is change the laws of the land. And I'd love to say we change them because we change the hearts of those communists. Communists have mothers too. But we don't normally change the hearts of those communists. We find something that they can relate to, where there's a vested self-interest. They want normal trade relationships with the United States. You can't have that if you keep beating up on these poor Christians. I don't really care about their motivation. I want to make things different and create sustainable environments, and you do that most often through a judicial process that people can ultimately find hope in a country. The reason why there's so little hope in Kenya today is because the judicial process stinks. Because of the former president, try to get rid of it. And so when you go into the judicial process, you don't know whether someone's going to tell you the truth, or they're going to bring false witnesses, or whether they're going to throw out all the facts. You can't count on it. Unpredictable judicial process is harmful. And so you have to change that structure if ultimately rule of law is going to be part of the answer to a sustainable environment for religious freedom in some of these most difficult places. Yeah. I'm done. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karis, and I'm originally from Burma. And one incident happened last year. My dad is a chairman for the Foursquare Mission in Burma. And one of the pastors in Golden Triangle area got jailed for quote-unquote preaching the gospel, and the Burmese military dictatorship found out, and so they blackmailed him and said, if your leaders give $7,000, then we will let you go. And apparently my dad somehow pulled the funds together and gave $7,000 to the militaries and got the pastor out. And my dad told him, you better move and to a different area. And he said, no, I can do all things through Christ who strengthened me. Oh, well, $7,000 is what the military asked for, and that's what basically got him out. But the thing is, though, that, he got all these gospels and all these, Jesus, I don't know, and he heard it from the missionaries who came from here. And so, and here, 2 years after that, missionaries coming back and telling him, you have to move again. And so this pastor is confused. So my question is that how can I, as an individual, re-preach the holistic gospel to America?
Re-preach? I'm sorry, what was the word?
How can I preach or re-preach the holistic gospel to America? Because I want to say that pastor, the pastor who's been persecuted, is somewhat, not shrewd. But then again, he also got this message from, missionaries from America. And so my question is, now that you talk about holistic gospel, approaching, seeing God as a whole and all that, and how can I share that again to my, churches in America?
Well, first of all, the situation calls for a great deal of shrewdness, a great deal of discernment, a great deal of wisdom. I thought you were going to ask me, did they do the right thing in paying $7,000? Because, you can create a market. And the Burmese military, as you know, is not blessed with a great deal of humanitarian instincts, to say the least. And Christians, as you know, especially the Karen tribe and tribes on the border where authoritarian states have the most vicious problems, those folks come into a lot of persecution. So Burma's not easy. Burma's not easy for anybody to fix. What you can do back here, of course, to the gatekeepers, to the leaders, to the opinion leaders, try to get folks to come to a better understanding of what the scriptures talk, what I think the scriptures talk about in terms of a holistic gospel. You have certain seminaries that are well known for this. You have certain schools that are well known for this. I presided over one on the East Coast, preaching the whole gospel for the whole world. And this was a big deal. The social and the personal gospel. The kind of conflicts that were fought 25, 35 years ago in theological institutions seem to be over and so on, but we have other problems. We are the ones who get in the way of the gospel. The gospel doesn't get in our way. And this counterfeit of thinking somehow that it's all about us. And if I was Satan and I only had one way to diffuse and diminish and de-energize a Christian witness from the West, what I would do is create a counterfeit gospel that is so close to the other one that you wouldn't know the difference, except it might not have the power of a holistic gospel. It might not work in difficult places like Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. And let me just say that in terms of your ability to do it, God has not called you to be successful, only obedient. So be obedient with the folks that you come in contact with. Let God keep score, and let God's economy carry the day. We don't have to have every pastor come to Yankee Stadium to hear Billy Graham. We can do this one at a time as the Lord gives us strength and wisdom, message, and audience. Yes, sir.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I have one question. In the circles that you're involved in your experience, how do you deal with the question of rights, not only for Christians, but for other faiths? Certainly Christians are not the only group or religious group that are under persecution in this world. And in a pluralistic age, what's the message that you give to counter, maybe not counter, but how do you approach the fact that, I don't know, where Christians are being persecuted and where other faiths are being persecuted? And do those go hand in hand as a human right? And where do we as Christians how do we think about that issue in this world?
Let me tell you how I think you should think about this. Martin Luther King said it best. If one is not free, nobody is free. You should be in the business of making sure everybody has the right to freedom of conscience. Right to believe or not to believe. Right to believe this theology or that theology. We need to fight for that. I think at the end of the day, our theology will take care of itself. I think at the end of the day, our God, our Lord will take care of themselves. But you have to make sure that everybody has a level playing surface under which to be free to choose. That's one of the great gifts, freedom of choice. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, we feel it comes from God. The secularists feel it's there as something that makes us distinctively human. It's what it means to be human, the ability to look at things and choose. So make sure that you are asking and demanding the same kind of freedoms for a Muslim, for a Sikh, whatever, as you are for a Christian. The other thing that happens, if you lift up Christians at the expense of everybody else, you only exacerbate the differences. It's a failed methodology. Back in the late 1990s, the House and the Senate were trying to pound out an International Religious Freedom Act, which they ultimately did in October of 1998. But the first rounds of that act lifted up Christianity. I remember I was at World Vision at the time, and Christian congressmen from the White House wanted to have World Vision sign on because we're big, because we got 5 million donors, i.e. 5 million votes somewhere down the line. They wanted our signature. We didn't sign because it was only about Christians. And I don't understand that kind of thinking. I was in Moscow speaking with the Orthodox Patriarch and the highest rated imam in that part of the country. The Orthodox Patriarch was very upset that we would, from the West, come into his part of the world. This is why they wrote the law that they did. We would come into their part of the world and steal their sheep. Now, stealing sheep and good sound theology are worlds apart. The imam